It gives me great pleasure to introduce Andy Goodwin from Brainlabs, who's going to start off the talks this evening. Andy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Simon. All right, so hi everyone, I'm Andy from Brainlabs. And what I wanted to talk you through today was a piece of research that we did a few months ago called The Three Faces of Modern Search. Now, when I say it's a piece of research that we did, that's the royal we. I had no involvement in commissioning this, but it's quite an interesting story, so I'm happy to stand up here and present it as if it's my own work, but just bear in mind that it's not. So the story sort of starts with, I guess, one of the big prevailing narratives that's kind of in the industry at the minute, which is we're at this point of rapid change, obviously AI is a thing, and we're moving from this world where we're kind of departing from traditional search platforms. I'm going to do a lot of traditional throughout this talk, being largely Google and Amazon, which have been kind of large mainstays of search behaviour for as long as we can remember. And we're moving into a space where there's far more players entering the mix and supposedly gaining share. So you've got that across social search platforms, but also all of the AI answer engines as well. And it's all very messy. There's lots going on. People bounce between all of these all of the time for every single decision they need to make. And depending on, I guess, where you get your media content from, you could be forgiven for thinking that because of this change, a big hole was about to open up in the floor and swallow Google and Amazon and all of the old players up. Obviously, we've got Google in the room today, so I'm going to try and not be too aggressive towards them within this talk. I guess really this kind of narrative got us thinking, is this true? So a few kind of leading clues. Well, firstly, Google's search volume isn't increasing. In fact, isn't decreasing rather. It's continuing to increase rapidly. We know that. Spend on Google is doing the same. This is a US data set from 2024 looking at, I guess, spend across the advertising industry in general. Search is this big yellow block up here. And there's a lot of different channels which are growing, seeing double-digit growth. But search is right up there in amongst that mix. So, advertisers aren't slowing down in terms of their investment in search. And then this is a room of, I'm led to believe, finance-y type people, so you don't need me to tell you what's happening with big tech stock prices over the last year. But when we look at kind of the Mag 7, and in particular, focusing here on Alphabet and Amazon highlighted, they're obviously moving up and to the right. So that doesn't quite tally up with this wider narrative that exists in the search industry at the minute. So we wanted to think, well, how can we actually get a real representation of what's going on if this data seems to be telling us one thing? And it turns out this is a way harder question to answer than you would think it should be, right? Normally in a world of digital, it's very easy to pull data sets from different platforms, match them up against each other, see which number's bigger, which numbers are changing the most, etc., etc. But there are a couple of reasons why it's difficult in this instance. So firstly, a lot of the supposedly new players on the scene are surprisingly quiet on this topic. You don't really hear Pinterest, TikTok, whoever it may be, talking quite as loudly as Google about the volume of searches that they get on their platform. Obviously, Google, 5 trillion annual searches gets touted a lot. You don't really hear that same level of conversation from the other players. So actually getting data sets in the first place is hard. But even when those data sets do exist, they're very hard to compare apples for apples, because if we're looking at a Google search, which we know is kind of a very well-defined thing, how do you match that up against, say, a search on ChatGPT, which is actually a multi-prompt conversation about one topic? It's really hard to know what you should be comparing against each other in that sense. So with those two barriers, we actually adopted a fairly quaint and old school method of trying to address this question, which is we ran a survey. And we gathered 3,000 people, so 1,000 consumers in the UK, 2,000 in the US, and we asked them, think of a recent purchase you made online that you researched before buying. To do your research, which platforms did you use for that information? Now, obviously, and this is a caveat that would apply to any kind of consumer panel-based research, there's lots of, I guess, flaws that you could point out in here. So, people don't always do what they say, there's survey bias, all this sort of stuff. But it does at the very least give us something we can kind of compare across platforms and have a bit of that apples for apples comparison. And the data that came out of that was actually very interesting. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what this chart is before pointing out the key features of it. So this is the results from the entire data set across both US and UK consumers. And this is just looking at a count of the number of times a certain platform appeared within each of those 3,000 responses. So for instance, if someone ticked 3 boxes versus someone just ticked another box, there'd be no weighting there. In the blue, we've got what we asked in the survey is kind of like your traditional search engines, so Google, Bing, Yahoo, etc. The red bar is then a AI chatbot answer engine, your Geminis, your ChatGPTs, Perplexities, and so on. In the varying shades of green, we've got various social platforms. We have also lumped YouTube within that green, rightly or wrongly. Yellow is then your more retail-leaning sites, Amazon, eBay, and others. And then as we move towards the right, we've got our brand websites here, so owned websites, and then more niche publications, community forums, taking up that final small slot at the end. And I guess there's lots of things in here to unpack. I guess the kind of key things that stand out to me here is, firstly, when we're talking about this question of like just getting information to make purchase decisions, I was at first surprised to see that social, cumulatively, that includes YouTube of course, is actually of relatively similar scale to traditional search in this survey, which was interesting. There's a piece in here around obviously, the fact that 0 clicks is becoming more of a thing. I think everyone's kind of familiar with that. And actually, if you look at brand websites, that bar is probably about half the size of traditional search. That maybe speaks to that point quite accurately. I guess the big one that probably everyone's eager to know about is the red bar, which is the AI chatbot. So that's currently making up around 5% of these responses that we saw, which is small. Obviously, it's not had a lot of time to grow there, but for the time being, it's not a giant chunk of this picture. We've got various segments for this. So the first one to look at is how did US consumers respond versus UK? And there are actually some quite substantial differences here. So what we've labelled as next-gen search, by which we mean what the prevailing narrative would have us know as next-gen search, i.e. social platforms, i.e. AI chatbots, they are far more prevalent in the US than they are in the UK at the moment. So we can see the red and the green stretch out much longer for the US, whereas UK data shows traditional search being stronger, as well as brand websites playing a bigger role. And then I'm conscious we are in a B2B and financy room, and I can very much detect questions screaming out in people's heads like, okay, but we're different to everyone else. Like, have you got data for our category? Well, we commissioned this research before I knew this talk was going to be happening, so we couldn't plan for this, but we do actually have a segment for, I guess, the purchase vertical that people were in at the time. Financial services included in that. And actually within this entire list, obviously there's quite a lot of variation between the different categories there. Financial services stands out in that it is heavier on the AI chatbot usage, and it's heavier on the social usage than many of the others. That's perhaps not surprising. It is a more involved and more complex buying decision than, for instance, what garden furniture do I want? So that sort of backs up what you might have as intuitive assumptions there. So far, though, that's kind of the picture of, on aggregate across all of these different users that were surveyed, what was the, what was the share of platforms in the mix? But actually, we asked these questions at a journey level. The question was specifically, think of a purchase journey, tell us about that. So we can go a level deeper and think about, okay, what's actually happening at that more granular level? And again, there's quite an interesting story that comes out here. So again, if we think about the commonly accepted wisdom, it's that, whenever someone's making a purchase decision, there's all these distractions, different apps, different sites on the website to go to get information, and people are bouncing around across loads of them to get that before settling on what they need. But actually what we were seeing, I don't know why I've got an animation for the headline, that wasn't meant to be there. Our data suggested that actually there's a relatively small number of average touch points per journey that was recorded in this survey. So 2.5 in the US and just under 2 in the UK. So actually on average, there's not a lot of this mad bouncing around for an individual purchase. So when we stay honed in on that, kind of specific view of a single piece of research that's being made, actually what we're seeing is consumers are kind of curating their own funnel for that specific decision based on their preferences, based on the category that they're in. So it's a much more siloed approach, even though it is true to say that when you look across everyone and you add all of those journeys together, then you do get this real jumble and a real diversity of platforms coming into play. There are also 3 personas that stood out from this data, which are worth introducing, and in particular worth focusing on the sort of the share of the market that they're commanding. So the first is what we've labelled as the traditionalists. Now, this is anyone whose journey consisted exclusively of Google's of search and of Amazon, so that no other platforms are coming into play here. They made up around 25% of all of these journeys. Probably the more interesting cohort, and definitely the biggest, is what we've labelled as the augmenters. So these are people whose journeys included a search or Amazon touchpoint plus something else. So there's a combination of, I'm saying the old and the new. The old is very harsh and unfair language, but you know what I mean. Like that's kind of how we're viewing it there. And they're taking up, as I say, just over 50% of all of these journeys that we speak about. And then finally, we've got the dissenters. So these are, in some ways, the most radical people. They are not using traditional search of any kind to make their purchase decision, which is wild. I would never do that. And they're sitting at around 20% of all of the journeys here, which is just a very interesting split to see. Like, this is the smallest group. And I guess when we think about that, it does, again, I guess in some ways count against the suggestion that actually, you know, the old way of searching is going away. Like that's not really the case. You may, yes.
Do they go straight to brand, or what happens here?
It's a good question. So there's a lot of variety within this. So this is literally just defined as anyone whose journey didn't have search in it and didn't have Amazon. So they could have been on social, they could have been on AI chatbots, they could have been on brand websites, they could have been on more niche publications. So yeah, there's really a lot of noise within that group. Again, we have this broken down by category. And again, financial services is probably one of the verticals within here that you'd say bucks the trend more so than some of the others. So we are, where are we? We're number 4 on here. Actually, we can see that the share of traditionalists within this category is like noticeably smaller than it is elsewhere. That kind of tallies with the previous category breakdown that we saw. And actually, augmenters and dissenters play a much bigger role within this space. This is basically in response to your question almost exactly. It's worth bearing in mind, like, it's easy to read these results and think that, okay, when we're talking about augmenters, we're talking about people who are using, say, these next-gen search platforms, i.e. they're doing social search, they're doing AI search. That's not necessarily the case. Like, it is very diverse. And actually, within our survey, what we're seeing is for those journeys that didn't have either Google or Amazon in, actually 70% of them were unique combinations. So people really were picking their own very precise, I guess, journeys to go on before making that decision. So that is basically everything from me. I hope that was interesting. The 3 kind of like closing comments would be, firstly, there are these 3 shopper personas that do define the market. So we're seeing a very clear kind of like distinction in behaviours between traditionalists, between augmenters, and between dissenters. But also at the same time, there's a lot of variety. Like when we look at that macro level, there is a very like colourful chart. The very first chart I popped up, there's a big range of, you know, behaviours going on there. So actually having a presence in all of those spaces is probably still a valid narrative and something we should be thinking about. Takeaway number 2, when we take it down to an individual consumer level, that messiness isn't quite as apparent, and consumers do tend to choose, for the most part, their own funnel, and it's a very, very specifically chosen funnel. And then the final piece is, as we've seen by the shares between augmenters and dissenters, the future of search is probably not get rid of the old, bring in the new. It's going to be more additive. It's about enriching the existing experience. And if anything, we can maybe suspect that the US might be a blueprint for where the UK search behaviour market is going to head in the next few years. I never really know how to close these things out, but that was everything. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm obviously happy to mill around for questions at the end. I think we've got a dedicated Q&A. So yeah, thank you all very much.